If you've been on the internet for a while, then you know it's filled with some of the worst media you can find. I have already seen my fair share, but I thought that I was done. That was until I kept hearing about this one manga that people claimed to be the worst of the worst. Now, things like the worst or the best no longer hold any value to me, probably because I've seen and read so much, but I got curious and I read Emergence. Words such as disgust, filth, and shock have never had so much meaning to me since school days, and for the longest time I asked myself why, despite watching shows like Koraku no Toki or hell, even Euphoria, I could never bring myself to care enough to discuss them, or if I did, why those shows felt like the very definition of a waste of time. Now I know why these shows mean nothing to me and why Emergence was not a mistake. Before I give my opinion on it, I have to say the first time I read this, I felt bad, to such a degree that I couldn't do anything for the next 2 days. And this is the very reason I'm here now. There are those who read Emergence and have since decided to forget it exists, and then there are those like myself who, for whatever ungodly reason, went back to it and read it again several times. I couldn't begin to tell you why, but 2 days later I jumped back into Shindo's Emergence and read it again. This manga has more merit than every hentai series I've ever seen. From its core structure to the underlying message, this is the most grounded psychological hentai I've seen, and I wasn't even going to talk about it, but it made me feel so much in such a short period of time, and I've seen so many people trash it that I want to chime in here. See, Emergence is the kind of grim, brutal manga that I would initially advise you to stay away from, but when you get down to it, while it's not perfection by any means, this is similar to watching Guns. I truly believe that some people may have a love-hate relationship with it, and for good reason. Now, I've seen many people call this realistic, and that is just simply not true. Perhaps a good way of describing it would be realistic enough. This isn't as abhorrently structured as Euphoria to the point where it becomes Deus Ex levels of incomprehensible, but it also isn't violent to the point where you start to realize that this shit just would not happen in real life. At least to some degree. Emergence is simply a short story about a high school girl. While I don't believe Shindo himself was honest when he created this, mainly because the sex scenes are overwhelming and because there are so many of them, I feel the plot ends up suffering, but as irony will have it, his story ends up being honest while he was just trying to create torture porn. This is an incredibly subjective point of view on the matter, and in no way am I trying to call the people who couldn't finish the manga or stayed away from it hypocrites for not giving it a chance, because I was on that same boat. From the outside, this looks really bad. I said that technically Emergence is well made to an extent, and it is kind of. In a this isn't your run-of-the-mill hentai that completely disrespects its own plot, but it's not Steins Gate levels of writing either kind of way. The most obvious plot problems involve the infinitely retarded behavior of some of its characters, which includes the choices of the aforementioned, as well as defined character traits which are mentioned once and then purposefully shafted in favor of cheap fanservice. There are also several problems unrelated to the story itself, which I'll get to. Emergence shows a ton of potential, technically, and it only serves to sadden me when all of this effort paramounts to a miserable facade. The artwork is the most subjective here, and I have no room to talk, but despite the questionable proportions for the women here, it's clean enough for you to be able to enjoy it. The page structure is fine and understandable, and the line art is solid. Emergence has a surprisingly good world building that is for the most part believable, and the progression of events makes sense. The beginning of the story does well to establish what is going on, and the ending is understandably dark and edgy. See, the problem is what's in between. Character lunacy and self-destructive character choices are best showcased by our most prominent characters of the story, Saki and Hayato. Saki's naivete is understandable to a certain extent. Everything about Hayato, however, is rushed and inconsistent. The manga establishes at some point that he is very good at singing. With that said, 80-something pages later, Saki is kicked out of his house because she is wasting all their money on drugs. Now, there's no excusing that, but I bet Hayato has by now managed to improve on his singing and... oh, he just plays video games all day and goes to parties with his buds. Why have redeemable characters when all men are rapists and assholes?
All men are pigs! All men are pigs!
I guess that's a possibly interesting concept down the toilet. And it's not going to be the only thing that gets flushed down this same toilet. It's the most frustrating thing about this. The universe is somewhat believable, but most of the characters aren't. Worse yet, the characters themselves don't seem to make any effort at all to be believable. It's one thing to write a character into shit, but it's another thing entirely to admit that you really don't care to develop any of your characters in your own story. Another set of one-dimensional Muppets are Saki's parents. Her father is not even worth mentioning, and her mother is a downright piece of shit when she had no reason to be. Essentially, she claims that she will always be on Saki's side, but switches gears instantly the second Saki's father admits that he has been seduced by her. The problem is, Saki was raped, and to make this worse, her mother doesn't even let her get a single word in before kicking her out, which is total nonsense considering how close they were. You don't make split-second judgments without listening to everyone's take on an event. That's not good parenting. That's just being stupid. This is done in an attempt to make you feel sorry for Saki, but considering Saki has the mental capacity of a 10-year-old and her parents aren't much better, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by the fact that they didn't teach her to never trust strangers. Which leads us to the starting point of the series. Hayato getting Saki hooked up on drugs, raping her, and then somehow getting away with it. Ignoring the fact that this is yet another series where the police doesn't as much as exist, this first date with Hayato has so many red flags it might as well be a background. And still, somehow it doesn't strike Saki that this could have been a mistake. Life lessons aside, I'm pretty sure you would have to be nearly fully mentally handicapped not to realize something is wrong here. I don't believe this is a be-all end-all point. The manga itself has a couple of technical issues which are more personal than anything and all revolve around Saki herself. She's never seen not having sex, and this is the peak of her character development. I think I don't have to explain why this is a problem. Also, there are certain fan service shots that simply don't work and I can't understand, but then again, maybe I'm the problem. What am I supposed to be looking at here? Ultimately, it doesn't matter how stupid the characters are, you still have what could be best described as the most naive person on the planet being used by scummy people. And this is something that happens quite a lot, especially with prostitution in Japan. Which brings us back to square one. This manga shocked me because it made me realize how privileged I am. No matter what I may lack in life, just having a support structure, be it genuine friends or family, is something that can save you. A simple life choice can drag you into self-destruction. Sometimes there is no good ending. You can have everything and you can have nothing at the same time. You can forcefully acquire everything only to lose it because you weren't meant to have it. You wanted something, but perhaps you should have taken a step back to realize that you didn't have to do all that. A simple concept of life which Shindo himself, with all due respect, didn't want to pass on. Now, looking at the afterworld, we can see a glimpse of what this story is supposed to be. I think that, just like School Days, which is a whole different yet similar dimension of Bad Choice Simulator, Emergence tries its hardest to be the worst ending to life itself. And my argument about privilege and life? Well, here it is. There are many choices that we make which define who we are in the present and shape us into who we will become in the future. There are many factors to life and many possible ways to live it. Of all the factors and choices, consider this, you're here today and you are alive, but that is because somewhere down the line a factor influenced that. It's interesting to think about what choices you could have made instead, bad life choices like drug addiction, and consider the fact that you probably wouldn't be alive today. I am not saying any of this to be edgy, although that is perhaps what it will sound like. This resonates with me when we go back to Emergence, summarize it, and realize what it is. The downfall of a teenager who fell into desperation and resorted to drugs to solve her own problems, which inevitably led to her dying. There was no silver lining to any of this. The dream she had before finally dying was a pretty clever asshole which almost fooled me as though it was going to end well. I came to the conclusion that a good ending might have been in the works, but Shindo didn't have the time to add it in, or just simply didn't have the interest to. The final product is a simple story which doesn't completely break suspension of disbelief, even though I feel it tries to constantly. A story which ends up being honest despite the push to pander to almost every fetish in existence, and a story which is nearly impossible to digest yet is so revealing. This has to be one of the most internally conflicting and polarizing series I've ever seen. A side note, and something I almost entirely forgot to mention here, I looked up the MAL page for Emergence, which for some reason was quite hard to find, and I noticed that in the recommendations there was a series I was going to discuss over a year ago. This was surprising because the more I dove into this rabbit hole, the more I realized just how similar some of these series are. There is Accelerando, a spin-off for Accelerando, and something that actually fucked with my brain for a second, TSF Monogatari, which was created by Shindo himself. It's no coincidence that a discussion on Accelerando, better yet, on TSF Monogatari, would have been a carbon copy of this video, and I'm glad I waited. Still, I found it pretty interesting how consistent his work is, even work that he's hardly involved in. This day was full of surprises. Shindo also has a Patreon in case you're interested and wish to support him. The link will be in the description. Emergence is quite literally Life is Bad, the game. I can't deny any of its merit. There is not a single hentai that comes close to this. I don't even as much as have a rating for it, but if you think you can handle it and for some reason are watching this video and haven't read it yet, you should. I've also never said this before, and trust me, this is no hyperbole, but me spoiling the plot here doesn't make it any less awakening. And yeah, I already know there is probably something much worse than this, and I don't want to hear it. Even I don't think I can handle any more of this.
All better pigs!